Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister for Gold and Love. By Gert Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. Chapter 1. The Marquis de Balboa. The autumn evening had arrived and the party had returned from the hunt with their dogs. They dressed for dinner at Rusting House, Lord Clifford's estate. The hall of the old aristocratic castle, that great space where the rich English prefer to hang out, and from which one reaches the various floors along the beautifully sculpted stairs, seemed to be empty. Only when a tall, slender figure with a springy step and almost inaudibly descended the thick-lined staircase, did a finely cut blonde woman's head rise in one of the armchairs that stood in the hall, and two large violet-blue eyes looked up inquiringly. The gentleman smiled and asked in a hushed voice, "Did I startle you, Miss Cole? Did you think it was the infamous Raffles who came to steal your golden locks?" The lady, now rising to her full height, had a slender figure, and was a most charming figure. She apparently did not agree with herself as to what attitude she should adopt towards the gentleman, who now stood before her and ran his white fingers over his beautiful black beard. Finally she spoke. "No, Marquis, I recognized you at once. I doubt, however, whether it is mere coincidence that we meet so often, and that even in this house, where so many people are gathered, we find ourselves time and again in each other's company. Perhaps it is fate that so often causes our paths to cross." She was silent, and the slender man standing before her saw a tear in her eye. He bowed and spoke. "I hope, miss, you take this the way you like it best. I would like to contribute something to make you look more satisfied and happy." Then he took one of her small hands, on which he pressed a long, heartfelt kiss. "But I don't understand your concern. Everybody loves you. You are under the protection of a venerable old gentleman, Colonel Gole, and I do not believe there is anyone in this house who would not, by all sacrifice, fulfill the least of your wishes." Miss Florence shook her head and said, "I would not have thought of you, Marquis, that you, like everyone else, were deceived." Astonished, the handsome man looked at the young woman's face, to which he replied with a smile. "One cannot always give in to one's suspicions, dear miss. I have noticed much that has been hidden from the eyes of others, and I think I am not mistaken in supposing that your grief is a matter of one of your nearest relatives. Isn't it true?" The beautiful girl nodded in agreement. And sobbing she spoke in a low voice. "And I am lost if no one helps me." Nightly he knelt before her, took the white girl's hand in his, and spoke in a serious, almost solemn tone. "In the veins of the Marquis de Balboa flows the blood of the ancient Saracen knights. My progenitor had himself burned for his lady, and though the customs have become less cruel, and though you, dear miss, would not desire such a trial of me, yet I beg you to dispose of me entirely, and make your demands in my regard so high as possible. The feeling I have for you is so lofty and sacred that I long to do something for you." Miss Florence had receded somewhat. From the words of the man kneeling before her, the glow of passion flared up against her, and she did not know what answer to give. The beauty of this man delighted her senses, his melodious voice touched her heart, and she realized that what she felt for the Marquis was the germ of a love which she scarcely dared to confess to herself. For a moment she forgot her sorrow. But the South American, who was said to have had tobacco plantations and other possessions of fabulous value in the Vuelta Abajos, herself insisted that she should open her heart to him. Oh, how gladly she did this! This Mr. Gole, the former superior of Her Majesty the Queen's army, this old soldier, who was regarded by all as a man of honor, was a great scoundrel, dangerous to any young girl. He pursued his cousin, who was really only a distant relative of his, with the perseverance of an old savage, sneaked after her into her dressing room, and there, after he had let the servants go, tried to carry out his shameful plans. He didn't want to marry her. He never thought of that for a moment. He wanted to make her his beloved, only to throw her away when he had had enough of her. The girl's cheeks were covered with a blush of shame as she confided these things of such a delicate nature to the young man, who listened to her with a frown. She dared not raise her pure blue eyes at him who had just told her of his tender feelings. But his heavy, gasping breath betrayed her how much her story touched him. And then she spoke at last, sobbing aloud. "I had a trusted chambermaid who had already served in my parental home. Some time before we journeyed to Lord Clifford's castle, the rich had my poor Betsy imprisoned under the false charge of theft. Now I am without any protection, and I shudder with horror to think of the moment when we shall return to our estate." She thought for a few moments, and then continued with a wild laugh that expressed infinite despair. "But he will not take me alive into his power. I'd rather die." Marquis de São Balboa had turned deathly white. The trembling of his strong hands and the rolling of his dark eyes showed the dreadful agitation in which the otherwise calm man found himself. With difficulty he could only ask, "One thing I don't understand, miss. After all, you are rich. I beg you not to blame me for my immodesty, but it is said that you have great wealth, so you are not dependent on this man. I know that you are of age. Is it then only out of respect for a relative that you do not leave the house in which your honor is assaulted?" Again bursting into tears, Miss Florence shook her head. "I was rich and I had yet to be. My parents did indeed leave behind a great wealth. But this man, who now wants to take the last thing I have from me, has also stolen my wealth from me. With my own eyes I have seen the will in which my father named me sole heiress." She dried her eyes with the fine lace handkerchief, and the Marquis said, almost impatiently, "And where was that will?" In a sad tone the young girl replied, "The document has disappeared. Another was found, when Papa died, with my uncle appointed as trustee of my estate. I myself would not get my hands on a single penny, while my father, who had never spoken an unpleasant word to me in his life, called me frivolous and wasteful. Mr. Gold had also been appointed executor, and the further conditions were that he had to take me into his house and that I would never have the property myself, but if I married my children would be able to dispose of the property. In this way the villain has warmly settled in," said the Marquis, whose nostrils were quivering with wrath. "Now I understand, dear Florence, that you have considered it an arrangement of fate that we have met. I, too, am grateful to chance, which gives me the opportunity to help you. Go back to Kilburn with your uncle, and be assured that he will never again venture to make you a proposition which might offend your honor. Yes, he himself will soon be happy, if you do not refuse him your help." Surprised, incredulous, and yet with an expression of hope on the charming countenance, she held out her hands to the Marquis, and cried in a low tone, "Will you help me? Oh, tell me, what wilt thou do? Do you know anything about my uncle?" Miss Gold couldn't ask for more. The Marquis could only promise her his help with a firm handshake and an eloquent look. Chapter 2. Disgusted Love. An elegant brunette came down the stairs. She was dressed in a sea-green dinner dress, which exposed her shapely neck and part of the full bosom. Mrs. Mabel Morton was certainly not much older than Miss Gold, but the tender charm which made the fair-haired girl so attractive was missing from her face, which was undeniably beautiful, but had an expression too passionate and nervous. Mrs. Morton saluted the young lady, and then with a slight bow of her proudly erected head, which was adorned with a pair of beautiful black braids, turned to the Marquis. Long and penetrating, she let her gaze rest on his face. But the Brazilian, who, as he told himself, was the last descendant of an ancient noble lineage of Spanish origin, looked past the beautiful woman with icy eyes. A sharp expression appeared on her face as she turned to the Marquis with the question, "And what do you say, sir, of the crimes which have been so troubling our capital for some time?" Watching with undisguised admiration the lovely apparition of Miss Gold, who had just gone up with a smiling farewell salute, the Marquis replied, "I really don't know what you mean, madam. Crimes? My goodness, there is so much going on in that area." But before the lady could answer, came the voice of Lord Clifford, an old gentleman of very handsome appearance. Standing at the top of the stairs, he joined the conversation. "But my dear Marquis, you ought to know that. Our dear friend apparently means the curious histories that are told about that Raffles, that arch-rogue." "Raffles?" The Marquis laughed. "Raffles? Oh well, yes, of course I have heard of that too. That is the admirable fellow who commits the most cunning thefts, especially in private homes, and who announces his arrival in advance." "Yes, yes. Right. Correct." Lord Clifford was pacing up and down the hall. "Yes, that's him. Of course, the mildest rumors are circulating. This man is said to be descended from one of our oldest noble families. He signs his curious notes, which several victims received before the theft, with the name John C. Raffles." The Marquis bowed his dark-haired head with a smile. "In any case, it is very polite to announce his arrival in advance. But don't you also think that the stories are very exaggerated? Perhaps some international thief has stolen jewelry or silverware from a wealthy family and a joker has taken the liberty to write to the robbed a letter, which he signed with the name, Raffles. From this the general public immediately produces a letter. Quite a novel, though it may well have been an ordinary fact." Lord Clifford shook his head, disagreeing with his guest. But Mabel Morton, keeping her eyes fixed on the South American, replied in an almost defiant tone. "This statement of yours is very humane to the notorious burglar. It does not, however, agree with the facts. Some of them are well known, for instance the jewel theft from the Earl of Kingston's house and the disappearance of the king's insignia. Each time, just before the theft was committed, news was received of the robbers' plans, and I think I know that the other cases also played out in the same way." "Ma'am," said the South American, "I have no reason to protect the criminal who has stirred up the general indignation." The lady, whose countenance showed great emotion, replied with a forced smile. "Did I say that? I only think that one should not concern oneself with matters of which one is actually outside." And then she continued in a calmer tone. "I mean, oh, you're right, we quarrel over things which are wholly outside our circle." Lord Clifford wanted to bring up something else, but a look at the faces of these two people, on which he read something he did not understand, but which gave him much to think about, made him cautious. It seemed to him that within a few minutes a declaration of love would have to come between the two. And wanting to please his guests in every way, he decided to leave them alone. "I beg you to excuse me for another 15 minutes, I suddenly realize that I must write another urgent letter." With these words he disappeared into the adjacent library. Scarcely had he closed the door behind him when Mabel Morton spoke to the Marquis in a low voice. "Now you will not escape me again. At last it must come to a clarification between us. Do you think I have not seen how you courted that young thing, Florence Cole? Do not forget that I have a right to your person and that I will defend this right until my death." She stretched out her hands to him pleadingly, whereupon he returned with a cool look. "Raoul, have mercy. Don't flee me, don't leave me. I love you and cannot live without you." She was silent. And while not a single look changed on the man's face, not a word passed from his lips, and not even a smile appeared on his lips, she remained dead white, and with an expression of despair on her face, she stood before him, words of love and tenderness whispering, which he did not seem to hear. Until at last, when he remained deaf to her pleas and told her nothing that he had understood her passionate words, an expression of hatred appeared in her dark eyes. Her delicate fingers curled around his arm, and beside herself with excitement she whispered to him, "Woe if you love another? I destroy you and her." He took another step back, and before she could speak again, steps were heard at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Clifford approached with her daughter Lilith and her friend Miss Ellen Graven, a wealthy American. The hall was soon filled with guests. Lord Clifford appeared to have finished his correspondence, and with him Commander Gull appeared at Sir Edward Touston's arm. Behind the good-looking old soldier walked Lord Emmerding, accompanied by Miss Florence Gull. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Dwarf. Dinner was over, and some couples, laughing and talking merrily, made their way back to the hall. "It is really very displeasing to me," said Clifford to Sir Edward Touston, in whose company he enjoyed a fine cigar. "That mysterious thief really embarrasses me. I have sold here, as you know, to the representative of the government vast estates on behalf of our whole county. This is related to the construction of the new canal. Tomorrow will be the disbursement of a very considerable sum of money, namely £100,000 in my house. If the sale concerned only me, I would simply transfer the amount to my bank. That is impossible now, however, because in this case I am dealing with a crowd of small farmers who are not satisfied with a scrap of paper, a check, which they have to pay. These people prefer to pay their money in cash, and so I am compelled to have the whole gigantic sum in my house just now. Of course I have a solid safe, but everyone knows that such security measures against our present burglars are of no value and of no value. These fellows work with all the aids of modern technology, and I must confess to you," Lord Clifford spoke in a low voice, "I'm not at ease." Sir Edward Tewston, who had previously served in the Navy and who possessed an unflappable composure, smiled. "You probably won't believe all that gossip, my lord. That mysterious villain is just an ordinary person, too. Release your dogs at night and give revolvers to your servants. If all that still doesn't help, have some London detectives come and watch them before you're safe. The peasants will be here soon enough to receive their money, and then you'll be done with it all." Lord Clifford shook his head, and at this moment Commander Goal approached the pair, inquiring as to the subject of their conversation. "We are talking about that mysterious burglar," said Lord Clifford. "I happen to be compelled to have a lot of money at home, and so it is understandable that I am somewhat concerned." "Lots of money?" asked Commander Goal, eyes twinkling with greed. "Yes," replied Lord Clifford, "about £100,000. These words caused a great change in the old colonel's countenance. He eagerly licked his lips, and his fingers curled convulsively as if he wanted to take a firm grasp on a huge sack of gold. "Ah, £100,000, it escaped his lips, disappearing beneath a thick grey moustache. These words caught the attention of everyone else present. Within minutes everyone was aware of the situation. They laughed and jested, and made Lord Clifford the subject of common ridicule, to which even his wife, an aristocratic pale lady, took part. The most laughing was Lilith, a charming brunette, Miss Florence Goal's girlfriend. These two girls, Miss Florence, too, seemed to be in a merry mood again, exhausted in fantastic descriptions of an adventure they would like to have with the mysterious thief. "I believe," said Lilith, "that he would be gallant enough not to steal from me." "Secure," came from the mouth of Marquis de Balboa, who had hitherto only taken part in the conversation with a smile. But as if he had already regretted this single word, he continued in an indifferent tone. "For a man, who is said to be descended from one of the old English families, cannot help but be polite to ladies." But the others shook their heads and said that it was better not to let it come to the fore. "Oh," cried Lilith with a mischievous smile, "of that we should soon be sure. The Marquis promised us the day before yesterday that he would hold a small séance in our midst. We simply evoke the mind of this genius thief." "But that won't work," whispered Miss Ellen Graven. "We have often spoken to spirits in America, but one cannot summon a living man." "Well," said Sir Edward Tewston, "we ought to kill Raffles before we summon his ghost." Mrs. Mabel Morton, however, spoke. "I think we can trust the Marquis with confidence. If he will let this remarkable criminal speak, you can be sure that it will come very easily to him, won't you, Marquis?" The South American thought for a moment, then bowed his interesting head in assent and said, without looking at those present, "I should in any case ask the party to follow me to the upper rooms of the house. When I was recently asked to hold a séance, I found the room on the pond side. I believe it is a drawing room upholstered in yellow silk, especially suitable for that purpose. You must know that the ghosts are not at all satisfied with every room. Certain dimensions are required. The sounds should not be too clear in such a room, but should be as soft as possible, for the ghosts do not like to reveal themselves too loudly. Everything should be done in a soft and muted tone. They are also sensitive to ugly and shrill colors. Yes, you smile, gentlemen, but anyone who, like me, has been in close contact for many years with those who are no longer with us, and who still surround us all the time, has learned to understand them, and take their wishes into account. If the host allows, we will make our way up to that room." An almost solemn mood had taken hold of the small company. Most of these otherwise scornful and superficial people were impressed by the mystery with which the otherwise enlightened English liked to surround themselves. There was perhaps none of them who thought communion with the disembodied spirits impossible, and the Marquis de São Balbo gathered a rather faithful company about him. When they reached the yellow drawing-room, and the servants of the lord hurriedly removed the furniture, except for a few chairs, had been removed. A small table, covered with a black velvet cloth, remained in the center of the room, in front of which the Marquis de São Balbo sat, seated on a stool on which he had laid some cushions. The lock was equipped with an electric light. A mighty dynamo, whose sound was lost in the vaulted cellar, supplied the current which illuminated the whole castle, which lay in the midst of rural solitude. Except for a single flame, all the lights were turned off. It was perfectly still in the not oversized room, in which the distinguished English ladies and gentlemen sat a fair distance from the Marquis, waiting for things to come. Except for a single flame, all the lights were turned off. It was perfectly still in the not oversized room, in which the distinguished English ladies and gentlemen sat a fair distance from the Marquis, waiting for things to come. The small table, covered with a cloth hanging to the floor, now rose about a foot under the hands of the Marquis and began to revolve in a semicircle about the South American in rocking motions. At the same time, as if coming from the depths, a buzz of voices was heard, as if men were singing a solemn song in a foreign language. This lasted about a minute and then stopped suddenly, as the table descended again to the floor and stood there. Now the Marquis rose, walked to the wall, where no one was sitting, and took a small package from his pocket, from which, stooping, about 2 meters from the wall, he sprinkled a whitish powder on the floor. After setting it on fire with a wax match, he jumped back as the fire spread over the powder with lightning speed. The attendant faint bang had startled the ladies, but before they had recovered from the astonishment, red, fragrant clouds floated up the silk-lined wall. Out of this mist, which gradually cleared through a window which the Marquis had opened, emerged a small creature, barely a meter in length, disfigured and hunchbacked, and with a disfigured, exceedingly ugly head. As he surveyed the distinguished company with wicked beastly eyes, the little man halted against the wall. Then he looked up at the Marquis, who suddenly held a small whip in his hand, threatening the dwarf. "What a terrible creature!" whispered the fair Lilith. "Oh, look how filthy he looks." But her friend, to whom these words were addressed, looked trembling at her uncle, Colonel Gole, who, in the half-darkness of the room, took much less notice of the mysterious dwarf than of the beautiful Florence, whose figure he devoured with lustful eyes. At this moment the ghost charmer's voice rang out with an almost unrecognizable tone. It sounded commandingly. "Tell us who you are." The dwarf curled up like a worm, but didn't seem to want to answer. It was not until the Marquis threatened him with the whip that he let out some incoherent noises, from which one could only understand that his name was Jim Gocky and that he was about to leave. "You stay," commanded the Marquis, "and you will tell us what you know of Raffles, who calls himself the Great Unknown." The dwarf grinned like a devil. Finally he spoke. "He is there he is, and he is gone again. When he comes, the great bell tolls. Wherever money or treasures are hidden, he knows where to find them. He takes it from the rich and gives it to the poor." Heedless of the astonished exclamations of the spectators, the Marquis continued with the greatest calm. "And can you tell me, Jim Gocky, where John Raffles is going next?" The dwarf hesitated again. He seemed to have no desire to answer again. With a leap the Marquis stood beside him, the whip whistled through the air and the little man put his hands to his face as if begging for mercy. Then he cried out, "Here he will come. Here he comes, already tomorrow." Lord Clifford had risen and spoke to the Marquis in a somewhat unsteady voice. "Would you like to ask him what Raffles will be doing here?" But not a word could be gotten out of the dwarf. He crouched on the floor and looked about him like a provoked little monkey, anxiously seeking a way out to flee. The Marquis shrugged, then again took the packet of white powder from his pocket and scattered the rest of it along the wall and around the dwarf in the same manner as before. The wax match flared up, rosy red, fragrant clouds rose to the ceiling, and when they were gone, the dwarf was no more to be seen either. But a cold draught passed through the room, and Sir Edward Touston, the most incredulous of the party, said to his friend Lord Clifford, "Where did that cold airflow suddenly come from? The doors and windows are closed anyway." The ladies surrounded the Marquis with admiration and asked him to clarify the strange case. This one, however, finished with a nice smile. He went downstairs and begged the host to have his motorcar drive up, as he had yet to go to London, where he was expected at the club. At the same time as the South American, Despite the general protest of those present, his young friend, Mr. Rudge Fitzgerald, farewell, and a few minutes later the distant thump of the Mercedes car was heard. Chapter 4. In Black Horse. By the evening of the same day, an impenetrable mist had gathered over London. The people were enveloped in thick black clouds, and it was very dangerous for those who did not exactly know their way around this giant city. At the corners of the streets, boys with flaming torches were seen, offering themselves to guide those who might have lost their way in the mist. Incredible as it may sound, the fact is that at a distance of 3 paces nothing can be discerned in this impenetrable mist, which, moreover, makes breathing almost impossible. After such a fog, the newspapers always contain long lists of people who have been killed in an accident and who have been lost. And that is not only what the Londoner was exposed to in those days, but protected by this filthy veil, which hides the whole city in its mysterious impenetrability. Crime lurks everywhere. In the eastern part of the city lies the Quarter of Misery, Whitechapel. A neat and decently dressed person is one of the rarities there. In the gutters one finds intoxicated men and, what is worse, intoxicated women. Where Whitechapel Road ends and Mile End begins, go right into Sydney Street. At that corner, lit by a street lamp, stood in the midst of the mist, in the pitch-dark night, a tall figure in a wide black cloak. It seemed as if the man, who could not be seen within 5 paces, was waiting for someone. A tower clock announced the midnight hour. After a few moments the stranger entered Sydney Street, where he again waited at the corner of the next side street. Though he seemed to be absorbed in thought, it did not escape his notice that something approached through the mist. And suddenly he was grabbed from both sides at once, while they tried to throw him down. The stranger did not defend himself, he barely moved, he spoke only a single word. As quickly as they had attacked him, the assailants released him. One of them muttered, "Forgive us, sir, it's from the fog." Then both vanished into the darkness, leaving alone the solitary man who seemed holy in the eyes of robbers and murderers. He continued on his way until he came to an inn, whose light cast a faint light on the street. But he passed the door of the building, walked to the wall, and was suddenly gone, as if swallowed by the black, damp clouds. In the inn, known to the criminals who gathered here as the Black Horse, there was a terrible noise. It was a large ground-floor room, which, filled with people and cigar smoke, presented an infernal spectacle. Maidens of the least sort, dressed up in old, dirty silk, with red-painted cheeks and black-rimmed eyes, huddled here with her lovers, none of whom earned his living honestly. On a podium at the back of the hall, a man and a woman recited oblique songs, playing the banjo. The shrill, deafening sound of the instrument, however, was drowned out by the harsh screams and shrieking laughter of the guests. Some distance away from it sat several men at a long table, engaged in all kinds of games of chance. Among them were some Irishmen, to judge by their red hair, who were not common visitors, but who had been lured here and now apparently being plundered. Already intoxicated by the gin and whiskey offered to them, the Irish watched with staring eyes the disappearance of their hard-earned shillings. Suddenly, however, one of them seemed to grow suspicious. Perhaps he had noticed the dishonest practices the banker engaged in. The Irishman, leaning his whole torso over the table, reached for his bet, in order to regain his possession of the money. But the banker, a fellow in a rogue's throne, drew out a long knife in the twinkling of an eye, and with a single thrust nailed the Irishman's hand to the oak table. The man roared like a bull that has received an axe blow. He and his comrades struggled to free the hand that had been fastened to the table, and now a terrible commotion ensued. A savage fight began, and the 2 Irishmen, one of whom had been nearly unconscious from pain and blood loss, became more and more drawn to the forced out. There, in the midst of the noise, resounded the incessant ringing of a bell. It was as if this sound paralyzed everyone present. An alarming silence followed the unheard-of alarm, and when the door was closed again behind the 2 Irishmen who had been driven out, the guests dared only speak to one another in whispers. He's there." The innkeeper, whose buffet was closed with iron latticework, only through a small opening, which could be closed, he served his guests. After closing the counter, left his seat behind the counter through a side door, leaving his guests to their superstitious fears. Not long afterwards the innkeeper, whom they called Double, probably because of his enormous physique and incredible strength, returned to the room, loudly calling out 2 names. "Save Bill and Tate Renard." "Brouillet and Vossikop," the latter horribly resembling the beast of prey from which he owed his nickname, went quietly and modestly to the small door which the innkeeper had closed to them, and were apparently envied by their comrades, disappeared a moment later. Chapter 5. The two men followed the innkeeper's steps like shy children, then down a corridor again, and then up another flight of stairs, until, arriving at another building, they came to a halt before a door, through which the innkeeper disappeared. When this door was opened again, the men saw the front part of a room, furnished with lavish opulence, and divided into two halves by heavy dark red velvet curtains. Vosicop and Derouillet stood with submissive reverence a few steps away from this porter. Suddenly a silver bell rang out, the same one that had just made the whole gang of criminals cringe in terror, and this sound was repeated 3 times. The two men barely dared to breathe. He was near them. He would give them his orders. They knew that they must obey him, and that death awaited them if they would withdraw from what he required of them. And they never thought of disobeying him. Like all their comrades, they revered this mysterious man, whom none of them had ever seen, and who reigned like a god over these rough fellows. They also knew that they could do no better than obey strictly. He, in whose service they all stood, was mild as a prince. Whenever one of them was in trouble or misery, he received help and assistance in sometimes inexplicable ways. He found friends where he had never known anyone before. The smartest lawyers took charge of his defense free of charge, if he had to appear in court. When he was imprisoned, he was mysteriously granted all kinds of concessions, in some cases even the gates of this gloomy building opened to him, or invisible hands furnished him in his cell with the tools with which he could free himself. Of all these things perhaps the two shrewd crooks were thinking, as the silver bell rang and a clear, exceedingly calm voice behind the red velvet curtains spoke the words. "I have sent for you, because you must go to Kilburn this very night. You must go there to get a document, and it is quite possible that they will make it difficult for you. I hereby tell you, however, that you may only return alive if you have the document in your hands. The layout of the house in which the piece is located, and everything else you need to know, will be explained to you in a minute." At the last words the light seemed to go out behind the velvet door, and for a moment the two crooks stood in pitch darkness. Then, however, the light grew bright again, and suddenly a short, disfigured man stood before them, no taller than a 10-year-old boy, with a horribly shaped head and odious features. It was the same dwarf who had appeared in Lord Clifford's castle that evening, and whom Marquis de Balboa had inquired about the mysterious Raffles. The little deformed man handed the Belgian a black place setting, which had the gold letters Junior on the reverse. Then the little man went to the door, opened it, and bowed with a scornful grin at the two criminals, who were now leaving. The two fellows did not have the courage to open the letter at once. Outside the door the innkeeper again waited for them, who led them back to the pub. However, he now followed a different path. Only when they had returned to Black Horse, the inn, which served as the gathering place for the criminals, and had taken a seat in a lonely corner, did they open the cover. They found in it a small note, on which was written with the typewriter: "Kilburn, Gloucester Street 3. Colonel Gole. Dangerous dog. From the garden through the window. Armed servant, render harmless. Ground floor right-hand study room. Writing desk, secret compartment document, bring immediately. John C. Raffles." And the two fledgling comrades did not hesitate for a moment to carry out the order given them. Chapter 6. The Stolen Millions. The prophecies of the little man had been laughed at in Lord Clifford's villa, whose appearance several members of the party that had attended the séance attributed to a skillful sleight of hand of the Marquis de Balboa. Such spiritistic séances are often held in English societies, and the sometimes very surprising results no longer surprise anyone. As the public is more or less gullible, they are regarded as real manifestations of the spirit world, or in other words they see in them only the successful tricks of some sort of sorcerer or magician. Yet Lord Clifford, who was immeasurably rich, but who did not feel much desire to lose so great a sum, had summoned a famous detective. With great hospitality he introduced Mr. Holliday, the detective, presented to his lodgers, none of whom showed how unwelcome this corpulent person with his self-confident eyes these finely cultured aristocrats in their midst. It was the hour of 5 o'clock tea and the ladies had already gathered in the hall in her light evening toilets. Only Miss Florence Gole, the chief's niece, and these themselves were still missing. Marquis de Balboa conversed with the detective, who told him long tales of his continued success. "I've been on the trail of this great unknown for a long time," he boasted, "and I can assure you, Lord Marquis, that the fellow is really a big fool. He tells in advance where he will come and steal. In addition, he delivers letters everywhere. His black letters have already become infamous. Believe me, Lord Marquis, it cannot be so difficult to expose such a careless criminal." An ironic smile played on the Marquis's lips as he replied, "As far as I know, this mysterious person has been carrying on his practices for over a year. I think, Mr. Holliday, that you and your colleagues have had ample opportunity to obtain possession of the great unknown." The detective laughed and said, "Very right, very right. But it is very difficult to gain access to the aristocratic societies. My help is not called in until the theft has already been committed and the trace of the thief has been lost. It is just so remarkable that this man always chooses soirees, hunts, or balls to make his mark." The Marquis nodded in agreement. "Well, this time it will be better. Our host thought of you in good time and had you come here precisely, because you are known as very competent. I hope you will do us the pleasure of catching the thief, if he comes, in our presence." With these words the Marquis disappeared with a nod through the heavy plush curtains to the adjacent library. He knew that this room had an exit to a side corridor through which one could also reach the upper floor. Without his steps being audible on the thick loopers, he made his way upstairs, where he crept silently to the door of Florence's room. His heart was filled with pity for the young girl, whose large, soulful eyes were always upon him with sorrow, and he feared her ever since he learned yesterday what a tenacious enemy she had in her uncle. He heard nothing for a while. Then, however, he heard sighs and groans, and it seemed to him as if he heard Florence's soft voice, and between them the threatening words of the old superior. Suddenly there was a scream from within, and the Marquis opened the door and entered the room, where he saw the superior standing at a table. His right hand was bleeding, while Miss Florence, pale to death, leaned against a cupboard with large, anxious eyes a little way from her uncle. "What do you want here?" the old colonel snapped at the Marquis. "I apologize if I interrupt," he replied, "but I heard a woman's cry for help, and thought I might be of assistance." "No one wants your help, you are an intruder," exclaimed the colonel. "I don't understand how one can be so impudent, without permission, to invade another's room." The Marquis saw that a small dagger lay on the floor beside the girl. He understood from the attitude of these two men, from the wounded hand of the superior and the deathly pallor that covered Miss Florence's fair face, what had happened here. The superior had tried to use violence to make his niece his victim. And the poor girl, who had nothing else left, had used a weapon, which she always carried with her as a last means of defense. The tall man with the proud countenance exchanged a long glance of understanding with Florence Goal, then went back to the door, saying, "The party is already gathered in the hall and you are already missing, Colonel. Permit me to advise you not to stay up here too long." The superior wanted to give an unpleasant answer, but in the dark eyes opposite him lay such an imperious expression that the old soldier turned with a scornful shrug and left it to his niece to answer. "Uncle, and I beg you, Sir Marquis, to excuse us for a few moments. We will come at once." When, after a short while, the Marquis had returned to the hall and was talking to the host, Colonel Goal and his niece had appeared among the guests. Marquis de São Balboa noticed that the superior's hand, covered with a broad strip of plaster, was covered. He smiled briefly and admired the heroism of the beloved girl, who defended her honor, weapon in hand. Music was played, and some of the gentlemen, including Sir Edward Touston, went to the smoking parlor to play a game of piquet, in which, however, the superior took no part. The latter watched over his niece with argus eyes, and the South American thus had no opportunity to approach the young girl. Mr. James Holliday, the detective, had the upper hand. He entertained the ladies with horrible stories of robbery, in which he always played the main part. During the evening Mrs. Morton to approach the Marquis. He was sitting in an armchair, examining a portfolio of copper engravings, depicting snapshots from the Scottish Highlands, when suddenly he heard a familiar voice pronounce his name. "Raoul, how long do you think I will be patient? I want to do everything for you. I even want to give up my hard-won place in these companies. I only want you. But I can't and won't live without you. So tell me what you think about it." Or, overwhelmed by her glowing passion, He was unable to say another word. The Marquis had listened to her Mabel Morton with a cool smile, and, looking at the Scottish Highlands with apparent intent, replied, as softly as she had spoken. "What do you really want from me?" The small, plump figure, who had bent her dark-haired head over the plates, trembled so much that he noticed it in her arm touching his, and he almost felt sorry for her. But then his gaze moved quickly and imperceptibly to the other side of the room, where Florence Skull and Lilith Clifford stood together, forming a delightful contrast of golden blonde and auburn. And with the same cold smile on his tanned face he whispered, "Do what you see fit. I hope that your stories will be believed." Thereupon he rose with a polite bow and, with a determined look on his face, went to the two young girls, who welcomed him with a merry smile. Tea was passed around and the sandwiches and pastries presented by the servants were enjoyed, while the lovers of alcoholic beverages could feast on many fine brands. By 10 o'clock Colonel Galt took his leave and Florence had to obey his imperious beckon to follow him. But as she passed close to the Marquis, she heard the whispered words from his mouth. "Fear nothing, I watch." She greeted him with a smiling bow of her pretty head. The other ladies soon followed, and some gentlemen also retired to their rooms. Others stayed in the smoking room, where they played. This is also where the Marquis de São Balboa went. Only the detective and Lord Clifford remained in the hall. "So it remains with our agreement," said the Lord, "and I hope you will have taken all possible measures, Mr. Holliday." He nodded in agreement. "Certainly, my lord, my two helpers must come at once." At the same time the distant sound of the bell was heard, and immediately afterwards a servant announced two gentlemen, who called Mr. Holliday wished to speak. "There they are!" exclaimed it in a solemn tone. A few moments later the servant ushered in two not very elegantly dressed gentlemen, who in appearance resembled old, discarded soldiers of the colonial army. They were tall, thin fellows with deep-set eyes in the tawny faces. They both looked as if they didn't mind a good drink. The Lord gave orders to feed and drink both men in the servants' quarters, of course. When he reunited with Mr. Holliday was alone, he asked, "So you wish to guard my study yourself?" "Yes, I think I will stay there. I put both my sniffer dogs in the library and the hall. Thus no one can approach me but must pass them first. And I assure you, my lord, those two have strong fists. And if John Raffles were a ghost, or if he came through the wall or the window, he would have to pass me first. And I, my lord, look at me, as I stand before you, with this fellow, with this scoundrel, this ridiculous scoundrel, I will complete the first 100 criminals I have already put behind bars." Unpleasantly moved by this great self-righteousness, Lord Clifford bade farewell to the detective, who now passed through the library to the Lord's study, where his safe was located. There Holliday sat down in a chair by the fire, put his great feet on the brass railing round about the hearth and began his task. He heard how the Lord's guests were still talking loudly in the library, then how the piquet players rose and slowly withdrew. Gradually it became quieter and quieter in the house. Even the servants, who still had a few things to tidy up, seemed to have gone to rest now. Chapter 7. The Black Mask. The long corridor leading to the guest rooms was dimly lit by a lamp of dark green glass. Behind the doors of the rooms one could scarcely hear a sound, perhaps a single sigh, let out in a distressed dream. The whole house seemed to have sunk into deep stillness. Suddenly it was as if from the dark shadows that covered the wall a tall, slender figure, dressed in black, appeared, which moved swiftly and silently over the thick corridor. On the other side of the stairs were some doors through which the mysterious night walker went. The man's whole body was wrapped in a black, close-fitting tricot, and his eyes glittered through the openings of a black velvet mask, which encircled the whole head. He disappeared into the chambers which Lord Clifford himself occupied. After some time he reappeared, holding in his right hand the bunch of keys which Lord Clifford placed on his bedside table every night before going to sleep next to a loaded revolver. The nocturnal walker went back down the hall to the light, which he quickly turned off. Now only the faint moonlight looked in through the high windows. Then the black figure slid down the stairs that led down. He had heard that Holliday had told the Lord how he would place one of his men in the hall, while the other should watch in the library, and the detective himself make himself comfortable in the study of his lordship. The most delicate ear could not have heard the slightest sound as the black tricot-clad figure descended the stairs. But the good servant of the secret police, who slumbered in a large armchair in the hall, had not even been considered. The black figure stood close to the sleeping one. An unpleasant, sweetish odor surrounded the sleeping officer, and the man's breathing grew fainter and fainter. The door to the library was not completely closed. The nocturnal walker opened it so gently that it was completely inaudible. But here too of you he could have saved himself the trouble, for Mr. Holliday's second helper was also in Morpheus' arms. He too was sedated after a few seconds. Would the valiant Holliday perhaps also sleep the sleep of the righteous? Thought the intruder. He took a black cloth from his stockinette, which he unfolded slowly and silently. Now he approached the door behind which Holliday struggled with sleep. The dark figure waited a moment, and then he opened the door with a steady hand. In the next moment he was in the study and had closed the door behind him again. He heard the detective jump from his chair, but already the incoming whispered. "Shh, Mr. Holliday, it's me, Lord Clifford. Make no light. I heard a suspicious noise just there and that's why I came here." "No, don't make a light," he repeated, as it seemed to him as if the detective wanted to take something from his pocket, probably a lantern. Now the detective, apparently quite reassured, approached, for the voice he heard was so expressive of the lords that he harbored no suspicion. He drew nearer the dark figure, which he could not discern, and, with a suppressed cry of terror and consternation, grasped around. A dense black cloth suddenly covered his head and was tied around his neck with a dexterous swing. At the same instant a fist, against whose force there was no defense, threw him to the floor, and a voice that made the poor man's hair stand on end whispered to him, "Don't make a sound, if your life is dear to you." Thereupon the detective felt a soft pillow slip under his head, and as his adversary laid him face down, any sound he might make was silenced. Mr. Holliday, who loved his life very much, did not have the courage to make a sound. He had clearly felt the cold dagger in his neck, which would surely be pierced into his flesh if he did not calm down. Thereupon the detective thought he noticed that the room was being lit. He heard a sound, as if the intruder was working on the safe. But everything happened with unprecedented speed. It was the poor man, as if only a few seconds had elapsed, then that dreadful voice sounded again close to his ear. "Take care not to yell for help until an hour has passed." It was a long time before Holliday, lying on the floor as if intoxicated, could make up his mind. Yet the desire for self-preservation triumphed over his sense of duty. Besides, he wouldn't be able to save anything from the stolen money, for he firmly believed that he had fallen victim to a more than brutal burglar. This he would also inform the master of the house, and thus explain his defeat as much as possible. But gradually it became almost impossible for him to breathe, and the fear of suffocation gave him the strength to turn with a violent movement and to emit at first vague, dull sounds, then a hoarse roar to rouse the inhabitants. He heard steps above him, then he saw through the thick cloth that the light was growing around him. People shouted, people asked, and at last he was freed. Sir Edward Tewston and Mr. Fitzgerald and some servants stood about him, and it was not long before Lord Clifford, too, had come down, pale-faced. In a tone of terror he asked the detective so many questions that he could not answer any. In the adjoining room servants were busy reviving Holliday's helpers. "But thank God!" exclaimed Lord Clifford, "either you or our intercession prevented the theft." The detective, who had now also been freed from the handcuffs and leg cuffs that the criminal took from the pockets of the two helpers, to use them afterwards in this original way, looked with despair and fear at the safe, which appeared to be closed and untouched. Hoping that he had made a mistake when he heard the ringing of the keys, Holliday spoke not a word, but Sir Edward suggested that the thief may have opened and closed the cupboard. One of the servants was immediately dispatched to the Lord's bedroom, and when the safe was afterwards locked, Lord Clifford, who, in spite of his good education, was casting a gross curse, saw that the great sum of money had been stolen down to the last penny. For a moment it seemed as if he were going to pour out all his wrath on the detective's head, but then the really great man controlled himself and spoke only. "I should have trusted myself too." Now he turned to his guests. "Even the ladies have come down without paying too much attention to her dress at this critical moment," and said to them, "I am very sorry that you have been disturbed in your night's sleep, but I beg you to reassure yourself. I hope we will succeed in tracking down the criminal and taking the stolen goods from him again." One of the gentlemen went to the window and opened the curtains. On the great lawns of the park the moonlight soot shone its ghostly gleam as a continuation of the mysteries of this night. Outside, the bell of the garden gate was loudly ringing. New terror and consternation took shape on the faces of those present. Two servants went out together, somewhat hesitantly, to see what was there. When they re-entered they brought with them a telegram, sent by the Kilburn police station, for Colonel Goal. The old superior broke it open with trembling hands and, after looking about him in despair, read the contents with deathly white face and half-loud voice. Broken into your villa last night. Servants stunned and handcuffed, no sign of criminals. Chapter 8. The falsified will. Colonel Goal, on account of this telegram, had already intended to leave at night, and with difficulty he allowed himself to be persuaded by his friend Lord Clifford to wait at least for daybreak. It was not yet 6 o'clock when the old superior reappeared in the hall. He didn't even want to have breakfast first, but his cousin thought otherwise, and in spite of the old gentleman's exhorting words she made her way to the dining room, where she drank her chocolate slowly, her big blue eyes always full of anticipation on the table. But he whom she expected, the Marquis, did not come, and with a sigh the girl had to get up at last to dress for the journey, when loud voices were heard outside and the chief of police entered with 2 gendarmes. Lord Clifford had already reported the theft during the night, so that the prompt intervention of the authorities was not surprising. The commissioner went straight to the colonel, who was ready to leave in his robes, and, after a polite greeting, said, "I am very sorry, sir, to interfere with your plans. I must, to my regret, give the order that no one may leave this house. Hopefully you will understand that there is no personal suspicion against you in this. I am only doing my duty." As an old soldier, who knows the discipline, the superior saw that he had to obey this order. With long strides he walked down the hall, now and then looking with menacing glances at his niece, whose fair face showed a kind of glee at this sudden delay. Now Lord Clifford also appeared. He welcomed the commissioner and apologized to Colonel Goal for this unpleasant interlude. "Oh, that time may not be too long for the superior, as I was just about to ask him for an interview." It was the Marquis de São Balboa who had spoken these words. He smiled politely and continued. "You will remember, Colonel, that last night we discussed a very interesting matter and finally agreed to continue this conversation in due course." Commander Goal looked surprised at the South American's words. He could not remember discussing particularly momentous matters with the Marquis the previous evening. Both gentlemen went to the library. Pointing at a chair with an inviting wave of his hand, the Marquis spoke. "May I ask you to take a seat?" The superior looked at him with an uneasy look, and it was certainly not his clear conscience that made him so uneasy. Slowly the Marquis took a large place setting from his breast pocket and spoke in a low voice. "Can you guess, sir, what I have here in this envelope for you?" With a swift movement the colonel rose, answering, "Sir, I'm really not in a mood to let you give me riddles. Do you want to fool an old man? Or do you think I have not been tempted enough by the dreadful tidings which I received last night?" With a cool smile the Marquis spoke, cutting open the place setting with a gold penknife. "Do you mean by that dreadful tidings, the tidings of the judgment of that old scoundrel, who favors all your shameful deeds, and has always aided you in everything?" Commander Goal stared at the Marquis, his face darkened with rage. But in a still hushed voice he spoke. "What do you mean by that? What mean these gross insults of a man to whom nothing can be said, and who is my faithful servant?" The Marquis nodded his head quietly. "That is quite possible. He was also such a handy forger of manuscripts, among other things, that he could easily draft this will and provide it with your brother's beautifully counterfeit signature. A villainous act, for which the daughter of Mr. Goal, I mean Miss Florence, lost all her fortune and was delivered to you." With a hoarse laugh the colonel exclaimed, "But you are insane. You will be locked up in a madhouse, or did you really think you would ever find anyone who believes your nonsense?" The Marquis remained exceedingly calm. "In any case, the witness-recognized handwriting of your brother will be believed, Mr. Goal. They will again take from you the wealth you stole from your niece, and you yourself will sit in Newcastle with your head shaved in the jail cell. Here, look." With his white fingers the Marquis held out to the colonel the real will, which the old hypocrite had darkened, and which named Miss Florence as sole heiress. The old man stood as if struck by lightning. He trembled over all the members. Hatred, anger, and mortal fear were written on his face. Shall I go to court with this will? Or would you rather voluntarily return the stolen to your niece?" With a scornful, cunning expression on his face, the colonel asked, "How did you get this will, my dear? I'm sure I put it in the secret compartment of my writing desk myself." "Ah, now I understand who made the break-in at my house in Kilburn. So it was you who gagged my arms, Bob." And then his face took on a truly devilish expression. "Then you are the—" With a single movement the Marquis stood right in front of him. "Not another word. Not a word, I tell you. Who I am is none of your business and has nothing to do with this matter. But who you are, that would be of great interest to the company gathered here at Lord Clifford's house. And I say to thee, Lord Commander, thou shalt not bear thy title much longer, unless thou accept the conditions which I shall set upon thee." "What do you want then?" the old thief asked in a dull tone. "Cut it short." "First of all, the return of Miss Florence Gold's fortune, then that you cease at once to shamefully harass this young lady." Pointing to the wounded hand of the chieftain, the Marquis continued, "If Miss Florence hadn't shown so much courage and character to defend herself with gun in hand—" "Then," interrupted the superior with a grin, "she would now be my beloved, and then it was none of your business. So," he continued, gritting his teeth, "is that stupid sheep in love with you? Then the only reason why thou hast had my writing table broken open, that you yourselves covet the wealth of Florence?" The Marquis answered nothing. After a few moments he said, "I therefore make the following conditions for you, Commander. As soon as the police permit it, you depart at once for Kilburn, and hand over to a solicitor, whose address you will inform me by post, the undisturbed fortune of your cousin. And as for the person of the young lady herself, I assure you that the least effort you make to somehow reconnect with Miss Florence would have no other result than your immediate arrest. You expose yourself to the same if you do not strictly obey any of my other commands. Think of this." With his head held high, the Marquis was about to leave the room when he seemed to remember something at the door. He turned and said, "As for your servant Bob, you know very well that the fellow has long deserved the noose. By this rogue innumerable men have been led to beggars, whose money thou hast offered to the playing devil. Because of him so many female creatures have perished, women whom he carried into your arms as victims of your shameful deeds. You will release him from your service. But he has, I believe, a young wife and several small children. It is no more than your duty to care for the family of him who has ever so diligently aided you in all your roguery. I cannot, however, force you to do so, and I know that you will not be disturbed by such obligations. So I will take that care on myself. One thing, however, I warn you, old lord." The Marquis looked menacingly at the colonel, who lowered his eyes before the wrathful glances of his enemy. "Do not think, Colonel, that you can cheat with me, though you cleverly devise a trap for me. I would doubtless understand who was the cause of that deed, and none but yourself would have the recompense for it. Are you ready?" the colonel asked in an angry tone. "Certainly," nodded the Marquis, "and I hope I never have to exchange a single word with you again." "Me too," grumbled the old man, and those two words were evidently sincere. Chapter 9. Competitors. Lord Clifford had searched the whole house with the police officers. The result, of course, would have been zero. The most puzzling part of the $1,000,000 theft, everyone thought, was that the keys to the safe were found in the same place where the Lord laid them every evening. So the thief must first take them away and, certainly a daring one, have brought them back after the deed is done. The Commissioner was just talking about this with Lord Clifford, when Mr. Holliday reappeared on the scene with the words, "My lords, there is no doubt that we are dealing here with an exceedingly cunning scoundrel." After uttering these extraordinary words, the brave man put his index finger to his nose and continued in a solemn tone, "For you see, this is the first time I've let myself be caught by a criminal. This man treated me like a chicken that people put in a bag to keep her from screaming. I don't think anyone will doubt my abilities, but even in the face of such shrewdness and unbelievable brutality I am powerless." The other two gentlemen struggled to suppress a smile. Here spoke Lord Clifford. "Is it not remarkable that the prophecy of our dear friend, the Marquis de São Balbo, has now come true?" The Commissioner, who had a very intelligent appearance, asked, "Excuse me, my lord, but when it comes to such a matter, every little thing matters. What was that with that prophecy?" "Oh," Mr. Holliday did not interrupt him very politely, "that's that kind of humbug, a so-called séance, which this gentleman has held here." The commissioner, who apparently already appreciated his colleague, took no notice of his resignation and said, "You would oblige me, my lord, to give me more details of this, and especially if I might speak to the gentleman to whom it concerns." "That is very easy," replied the lord, "for there he is coming." He pointed to the Marquis coming out of the library. The gentlemen greeted each other with a polite bow. The lord introduced the commissioner, and he inquired about the details of the séance. "You are a spiritualist, sir?" The Marquis nodded in agreement. "Indeed. I am generally regarded as an extremely suitable medium to act as a mediator between the spirits surrounding us and those who are still compelled to wear the mortal sheath." "And so you are of those who believe completely in this curious science?" "I think I have already given you the answer to that," said the Marquis, in a somewhat cool tone. Sure. The officer thought. "You must keep my questions good for me." "Of course," interrupted the Marquis in his usual polite tone. "If you will, I will make your task easier by giving you a detailed description of the séance which I was allowed to hold for Lord Clifford and his guests." The commissioner listened with keen attention, and then expressed his wish to personally view the scene of the session. As the gentleman went up, the commissary again asked the Marquis, "Then it is not possible for you to give an explanation for the appearance of the dwarf?" The Marquis de São Balboa shrugged and said, "For us spiritualists it suffices to say that one of the spirits of our dear departed ones materializes to such an extent that we can perceive it with our feeble human senses. That the mind took the form of a dwarf is a coincidence. In any case we have neither the right nor the power to investigate the mysterious reasons of this. For us spiritualists, the fact is enough." The commissioner did not show what impression the Marquis's words had made on him. He quickly examined the room where the séance had taken place, and then went downstairs again with the gentleman, where breakfast was ready in one of the rooms. Now Sir Edward Touston and Rudge Fitzgerald also appeared, proposing a plan to return to London after breakfast. The other guests, including Colonel Gole and the Marquis de São Balbo, also ordered their carriages. Only Miss Florence promised her friend Lilith Clifford to remain in the hospitable house for a few more days and, to the amazement of most present, Colonel Gole seemed to approve of his cousin's plan, whom he would never otherwise leave alone. Nor did he care when after breakfast she disappeared on her friend's arm. Only when immediately afterwards the Marquis also left the dining room did he become restless. And he had made no mistake in assuming that blonde Florence and the South American were parting ways upstairs in the hall. They stood, partly hidden behind the heavy curtains of one of the windows, speechless, holding hands. Florence sobbed and whispered how hard it was to say goodbye and how gloomy she saw the future. He consoled her with an endearing smile on her fair face, and repeated again and again that they would soon see each other again. They forgot all about them and did not hear the approach of soft steps. Two eyes, twinkling with hatred, were upon them, and the small, graceful figure of Mrs. Mabel Morton bent over with effort to overhear the words the two spoke to each other. She couldn't, but what she saw was enough to arouse her jealousy. Suddenly a thought occurred to her. Inaudible and unobserved she went down again, where she took a seat beside Lady Clifford in the dining room, and in a flattering voice she whispered to the kind lady, "My dear madam, do you mind that while my dear friend Florence Gole is still with you, I don't leave either? It is true that I have given orders to pack my suitcase, and I am also afraid that because of the misfortune that has befallen you, you may prefer to see your guests leave." She paused and looked timidly ahead. The old lady hastened to assure with cordiality that Mrs. Morton was always a welcome guest at Rasting House. This theft was admittedly an unpleasant history, but Mrs. Morton could stay as long as she wished. And so she, the little vengeful creature, picked up from the gutter in Whitechapel in her youth as a little proletarian child, who had subsequently become an actress and, having ruined a multitude of men, had married an old, wealthy patrician. He had not long enjoyed his marriage, death had overtaken him. Mrs. Morton had grown cautious after that. Far too wise to jeopardize her place in high circles, she did everything she could to maintain appearances, attended church faithfully, and gave large alms when the world came to know. As soon as the rest of the party had left Rasting House, she sent her maid to Miss Florence, with a request that the young lady, if she had time and desire, spend 15 minutes in Mrs. Morton would like to come. Mabel Morton, who was the older of the two and a married woman, could afford this, and Florence unsuspectingly accepted the invitation. Warmly greeted by the little brunette, she took a seat next to her on the sofa, and soon the two were chatting amiably about fashion, theatre, and the like. Mrs. Morton was very skillful in bringing the conversation to the subject of her interest, and it did not displease Florence to hear the sudden mention of the Marquis de São Balbo. Mabel Morton thought he was very interesting and distinguished, and the young girl agreed completely. But her little face took on a tense, almost frightened expression when the young woman suddenly spoke. "It's a pity that people don't know what's in him. I don't believe he is who he pretends to be." A soft blush colored Florence's cheeks as she replied that she could not believe it. She had never met anyone who had made such a favorable impression on her. With an incredulous smile, Mrs. Morton, after a short pause, "I wish I could think as you do, but to my regret what I know is in direct contradiction to what I would like to believe." And with glee she continued, "You are also very interested in this man, are you not?" Florence Gold nodded assent, her blue eyes brimming with tears. At this frank confession the false friend changed her attitude, and like the hiss of a snake it sounded from her lips. "I'm right, then, you love the Marquis. And if I tell you that this man is not worthy of your love, that he is a criminal, who has already been acquainted with the police and with the prison." At these words, Florence straightened to her full height. "That is not true. That's a vicious lie." Like a wild cat, the little woman sprang toward her. "Take those words back. I command you to take back those words, if you do not want me to prove to you in full company that I have spoken the truth." Florence trembled. Her mind told her that she would do better at this moment to be silent. All the details that had remained inexplicable to her in the actions of the Marquis loomed up in her fast-working brain. From the prediction of the theft by the dwarf to the sudden appearance of her father's will, which had apparently come into the hands of the Marquis as a result of the burglary of her uncle's house, all this she now thought of. And though this did not diminish her love and confidence in the man she adored, yet she felt with feminine instinct that she had to face Mrs. Morton should be as careful as possible. This woman loved the Marquis too, Florence no longer doubted. The blonde girl deliberately exaggerated her sadness and let her tears flow freely. Sobbing she said, "And how do you know all this? How do you arrive at these dreadful accusations, Mrs. Morton?" Mabel Morton was trapped. She thought she had already triumphed over this young, inexperienced girl. She told how she was the savior who had mercifully reached out to the ruined man through his own fault. "And this is my thanks." She spoke at last, full of pathos. "This is my thanks for erecting it again until it is in better surroundings. Now he turns to you, this trap. And he tells you the same lying stories with which he once bewitched me." Florence Gold, who never for a moment thought of distrusting the beloved, played her part excellently. A certain foreboding told her that this woman's Marquis was imminent, and that only by cunning and great cunning could she avert the misfortune from the beloved head. "What shall I do?" she sobbed. "Give me advice, help me, dear Mrs. Morton." This one pretended to be thinking. At last she said, looking at the weeping girl with stern eyes, "The only thing left to you is to give up this man and leave it to me. I rescued him from the mire in which he was already threatening to suffocate, and I believe I have the strength to put him on the right track once more. My love is pure and unselfish, and I want to make him a better, happier man." The fair maiden humbly bowed her golden head, and, astonished at herself, took the young woman's hands and pressed them to her breast, as with a silent promise. Thereupon they parted, both determined to visit as soon as possible the man to whom she loved. Chapter 10. The False Players. The Marquis de São Balbo lived in the prime borough of London, near Pall Mall. There was almost always such peace and quiet around the little villa, which lay in the middle of a beautiful garden, that most of the passers-by thought the house was uninhabited. Inside the small building was furnished with great opulence. 2 men took care of the ministry. He had brought these men, he said, from his native country. On the first floor was the Marquis's study. Here too there was a sybarite opulence. Weapons and rare hunting trophies could be seen everywhere on the walls. While enjoying a good glass of brandy and a nice Havana, the South American was chatting with his friend Rudge Fitzgerald. "You are so gloomy today, my dear Charlie," said Lord Lister, for that was the Marquis's true name. "It almost seems to me that you no longer trust your best friend." The other shook his head in silence. Did you lose at the game? Asked Esau Balbo, alias Lord Lister, after a short pause. Charlie nodded. Loads of? His friend asked. A lot, replied Charlie in a dull tone. Surely I should know how great the amount is? But the younger of the two apparently did not have the courage to name the amount. I'll start at £1,000. Rudge shrugged in silence. Good, more so. And the Brazilian looked thoughtfully at his young friend for a while, whereupon he said, I don't understand it, my dear boy. We have known each other for quite some time now, and you should have known that I am ready to help you in any case. So I ask you once again to tell me how much you have lost. Charlie hesitated for a few moments, after which he spoke in a soundless tone. About £10,000. Gem, grumbled the Lord, that's about £250,000 francs. I still count with French currency since my last stay in Paris, which I always fondly remember. Yes, that is a lot of money, but as they are honor debts, you must pay them at once. However, I no longer own anything. It sounded desperately from the young man's lips. Well, said Lord Lister, indifferently, thankfully I'm in better cash at the moment. At that he took a heavy wallet from his breast pocket and counted out £12,000 bills for his friend on the small Persian smoking table inlaid with gold and mother of pearl. He was already about to put his wallet away again when he changed his mind and said, But then you also need a little working capital. 3 more £50 bills for the boy Fitzgerald to put down. The latter kept his aristocratic blonde face averted, while his broad chest heaved with emotion. Suddenly he threw both arms around his friend's neck and thanked him in a voice trembling with emotion. The Marquis, whose sun-tanned face shone with satisfaction, patted his young friend lightly on the back and spoke in a more serious tone. So now that we've put an end to this petty story, I don't blame you. Well, no. You know I don't like morality, and I understand that any passionate player can at some point be out of luck. We all depend on chance. But still, I confess it to you honestly, this case seems suspicious to me. Of course you played in the four-in-hand club and lost there, didn't you? The youngest confirmed his friend's suspicion. Well, said the Marquis, I got to know this club too, and if you'd followed my advice, you wouldn't have tried your luck there again. I myself will never play there again. Startled and amazed, Fitzgerald looked at his friend, asking, But aren't it only gentlemen from the first circles who come there? There is not a single bee who should be suspected of an unfair act. This is very special in the game, said the Marquis. Honest men, when they have the cards in hand, sometimes become the most dangerous impostors within a month. But besides that, I'll tell you right away, mention the name of one of the gentlemen, who is one of the greatest villains, Colonel Goal. But I pray you, how can you say such a thing? I only assert what I can prove, and I will never falsely suspect anyone. But we will not argue about it. In any case, you now have to go to the club to pay your debts, and maybe you even plan to take revenge. I warn you about that. Please leave that to me. I believe I shall be able to give you the satisfaction of exposing those who are not of the honest players this evening. I'll give you a few more names along the way, which, I think, don't sound too honest. Half an hour later the two friends entered the gaming room of the four-in-hand club. The first to meet the friends in the game room was Colonel Goal, who shook hands with him and his friend with great cordiality, as if nothing had ever happened between him and the Marquis. The previous night the Colonel, as banker, had become Fitzgerald's principal creditor. The latter now hastened to discharge his obligations to the superior. This was done with indifference, as if he were offering the old gentleman a match, and with an equally nonchalant gesture the crafty fox let the banknotes disappear in his wallet. The gentlemen sat together in groups, talking and smoking, but it was not long before the desire for the game became too strong for them. The green tables were set by the waiters, and the heavy lamps were lowered to just above the tables, so that the players themselves sat in semi-darkness, and the expressions of their faces were hidden from even the nearest seat. The Marquis and his friend had sat down opposite the banker and watched the baccarat game first, without joining in. The fellow players had drawn lots and the Colonel had received the bank. It was a happy coincidence that the Colonel sat down opposite the Marquis. The game began, and as usually seems to be the case, the stakes were small in the beginning. The mood was initially rather listless. Now, however, one of the gentlemen placed a £20 note for the first time, Some other players followed suit, and so suddenly a considerable sum of money was in the pot. The Marquis did not take his eyes off the banker. He saw clearly Colonel Gole holding one of the cards close to the edge of the table in both hands. The old seasoned player seemed to be in two minds as to whether he should take another card, which could be dangerous, since the rule in baccarat is that one may have 9 points if possible, but above all no more. The banker seemed uneasy under the penetrating gaze of the South American. He suddenly revealed his cards and had 8 points. That was the so-called little blow. However, as several players had 9, and thus the big trick, the banker had lost. In the merry excitement that always reigns among the fellow players when the banker has to pay a large sum, perhaps none of them had noticed the pallid face of the superior. The Marquis, too, pretended not to notice and laughed politely. At this the game started again. Now the Marquis rose, while his younger friend took his place. Balboa left the gaming room through the right door. Apparently he went to the adjoining room to feast on the well-stocked buffet. The game continued, and it was as if luck now smiled upon the banker, for he now won all the larger sums, while the smaller sums largely fell back to the players. However, the hall had a second exit, which led her to a smoking parlor, where no one was during the baccarat game. A heavy doorman closed off the entrance to the gaming room. No one, not even the suspicious Colonel Gole, noticed that, as the game progressed, the doorman moved an inch apart. Through that opening lurked the Marquis Argosai, and he made a most curious discovery. A few players had again wagered large sums, and a pile of chips, which were bought at the cashier, each representing a certain value, filled the pot. Again, the banker first looked thoughtfully at his cards, which consisted of a queen, which does not count in this game, and a 7. Meanwhile, his left neighbor, who had passed and laid his cards face down on the table, had hidden his right hand for a few moments in his low-cut waistcoat. The colonel pretended he was still thinking, moving his head forward in the process. He nodded twice in succession. This the Marquis saw clearly. And suddenly the hand of his neighbor, of course the accomplice of this cheating gambler, appeared apparently unintentionally from the waistcoat and moved under the edge of the table. No one could see it. Ha ha! Now that hand, which held a card, was under the two hands of the banker, who rested on the edge of the table, and with unexampled dexterity, without even moving, grasped the presented card under the table. Immediately after this, the colonel laid out his cards. He had 9 and thus won the game. But he had no opportunity to collect his winnings. For suddenly, as if he had emerged from the ground, the Marquis de São Balbo stood between the banker and his accomplice. With a single jerk he had torn open the black vest, which revealed to the astonished eyes of those present 2 long, narrow pockets on the inside of the vest, each containing a complete and apparently arranged deck of cards. The vest's owner wanted to defend himself, but a punch from the Brazilian threw him to the floor with his chair. Colonel Gole had remained calm, hoping the attention would not fall on him. But in the next instant he realized how wrong he was. The Marquis counted through the 2 decks and then said, "Gentlemen, 1 deck lacks a card. As you see, it is 2. And these 2." He slapped his hand on the 3 cards exposed by the banker. "These 2 are here. It is the lucky card with which Colonel Gole has just plundered you." It was a good thing that the Marquis had to match his courage with a great deal of agility. The superior had taken a revolver from his pocket, but the bullet from the first shot, which the Marquis had deftly blocked, hit the top of the wall on the opposite side of the hall. In an instant the colonel was flung to the ground and disarmed. He cursed and jeered like a madman, but none of his words made any impression on the gentlemen present. He called the Marquis a thief, and claimed that all the great and mysterious thefts recently committed and undetected were on his account. He might as well have claimed that the King of England was a silent killer. The only result he achieved was a threat of binding and gagging him until the police arrived. In reality, however, there was no intention of involving the government in this matter. The Lords were of the opinion that it was best in the public interest to simply let the 2 scoundrels run. They were demanded, however, that they should never again show themselves in this part of the city. The superior's accomplice stole out like a beaten dog, but the old soldier himself left the hall with hatred eyes at the Marquis and with savage threats, which the Brazilian heard with a scornful smile. Chapter 11. Jealousy and Revenge. After the fog had lifted during the night, it now again covered the giant city. At noon, though all the lanterns were burning, Not even a hand could be seen in the great squares. Pitch black darkness surrounded London. The vehicles had to stop in the wide streets where they happened to be, and the road could not be more dangerous for pedestrians than in the streets of this metropolis. In such weather, of course, anyone who can at all remains safe at home, and no visitors are expected. And therefore the Marquis de São Balboa was all the more surprised when the electric bell rang loudly and persistently. At the beckon of his master, one of the two men rushed out, and immediately afterward Sam returned with one whom he carried more than guided. The Marquis, who stood on the threshold of the room, did not dare believe his eyes when he recognized his friend Florence Gull in the female being, wrapped in shawls and shawl, sinking almost unconscious on a chair. He ordered one of the men to bring invigorating drinks, and when the Brazilian had refreshed the girl and led her to the blazing fire, she, with all her strength, soon regained herself. "You must go," she exclaimed, anxiously, "immediately. They are on your trail." He smiled. "Tell me everything," he demanded with great calmness. "Ask," she exclaimed, "if there were not such a heavy fog they would be here long ago to take you to prison." In a calm tone, which was certainly admirable in these circumstances, he replied, "I will not go to prison, I will leave that to others. But come on, we want to go to my study, it's more cozy there." Her warning and her fear, nothing seemed to impress him. "But don't you hear me?" she begged again, "they are on your trail, they know everything and are chasing you, Mrs. Morton." He interrupted her with a smile. "So, she has been chatting after all, that little witch. So you also now know who I am?" The beautiful girl was silent, gazing sadly into the golden light of a table lamp that stood on the Marquis's writing table. "So you did find out," said the Marquis, laughing. "And now they're coming to capture me, aren't they?" "Yes." She looked at him pleadingly with her wide eyes. "Run while you still can. I'll stay here and inform you of everything that happens." "You are so good," he whispered. "But now I beg you to get ready to go again." The Marquis pressed a button, and immediately after that Sam came in with the girl's clothes. When she was ready, the Brazilian still wrapped herself in a soft, fur-lined cloak. Chapter 12. In the mist. A few moments later John Raffles was alone. But the man could not long have left the house with the Florence entrusted to him, when the bell rang again, loud and insistent. With a scornful smile and a determined look on his face the Marquis now called his other man. He spoke a few words to him, after which the crucible head went away, to return after a short while with 4 gentlemen. It was Lord Clifford, then the detective, Mr. James Holliday, a London police commissioner and a uniformed officer. "You wish, sirs?" asked the Marquis, with a polite greeting, pausing at his writing table. "You needn't ask long about that," said the detective, who now felt completely master of the terrain. "You have fooled us long enough, or did you think we don't know who the infamous Raffles is? Would you rather that we wait until you have stolen another million?" The Marquis looked at the detective for a few moments with a pitying smile, then said to Lord Clifford, "What this gentleman says does not interest me in the least. He owes the great honor of being allowed to be in my room solely because of the company he is in at the moment. But you, my lord, I should like to ask you what gives me the pleasure and honor of your visit, and why you come to me in the company of policemen." It was evidently less pleasing to the lord to have to answer this question. He nodded several times, stroked his thin skull with his glittering brilliant hand, and said, "Yes, indeed, it is very painful, but one do you suspect? You would see for yourself, my dear friend, if you knew all the details. The suspicion that falls upon you is so strong." "May I ask what they suspect me of?" it sounded back in an ice-cold tone. Now the police commissioner spoke, and in a curt, stern tone he said, "You are suspected of having stolen the sum which Lord Clifford kept in his safe." "Who suspects me of that?" "Lord Clifford himself." The Marquis looked long and earnestly at the nobleman, and then said nothing but, "Oh, that hurts me a lot." And to the commissary he went on proudly, "I need certainly not tell you that the imprisonment of an Englishman in his house is possible only by a special written order from the Secretary of State for Justice." "But you are not an Englishman," smiled the officer mockingly. "Then, in the face of a stranger who enjoys the hospitality of your country, may you afford what an Englishman would not tolerate?" The commissioner now cried impatiently, "I don't want to argue with you. March, come on." Take your coat and hat and follow us to Scotland Yard, or should I use force? The Marquis took a step back. There was such a menacing expression on his face that the brash detective, having in the meantime uncovered the iron handcuffs, put them away as quickly as possible. "I will prove to you," said the Marquis, "that I know what is owed to the authorities, even if there is such a great error as is the case here. And as I understand that you will not permit me to go to my dressing room, I will order my servant to bring my clothes here." The Brazilian pressed the electric bell. Immediately afterward the man appeared, who, at a brief command from his master, brought his coat and hat, and helped him to put it on. At this the Marquis said a few words in Spanish to the man, which the chief of police forbade him. The Marquis dug into his breast pocket and muttered, "My wallet. Yes, I have it." "You had better give it to us at once," came again from Mr. Holliday. "The stolen money must be in there." "Just a moment," replied the Marquis. "I just want to light a cigarette." At these words he stooped to a small cigarette case on the writing table and at the same time pressed a spring hidden beneath it. In the next instant deep darkness enveloped the persons in the room. The superintendent leapt forward and at the same time tried to extract his electric flashlight from his jacket, but he tripped over a protruding leg and Mr. Holliday received such a resounding blow that the fire sprang from his eyes. Lord Clifford and the policeman thought it best to remain calm. All that was heard was a sneer. "Good evening, gentlemen," from the Brazilian's mouth, then rapidly receding steps and a slamming door, for which the policeman searched long in vain in the pitch darkness that surrounded them. And when this door was finally found, an Egyptian darkness enveloped them outside the room too. "The fellow has turned off all the electrical conduction," exclaimed the detective. "But wait, gentlemen, if I catch him." The others couldn't contain their laughter. With great difficulty and always trying to find the way with their hands, they finally reached the front door of the villa. Outside hung the mist, the impenetrable black English mist that had been hanging over London for days, which made any pursuit of the fugitive impossible. Thus Lord Lister, surnamed John Raffles, the great unknown, escaped from his pursuers. The end. We will find out in the following episodes what dangers he went into again. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.